the Mission Zero Coalition. At a Crossroads, Pathways to a Net Zero Future is now live online. So if you want to sort of download the report, you can direct your phone to the QR code and you should be able to get that up on your devices. The report is the product of around 7 months at work of the power generation network that I've been delighted to co-chair with Dan McGrail here, Chief Executive Officer of Renewable UK. And for those of you who are familiar with the work of the Mission Zero Coalition, it was established last March 2023 on the back of the government's response to the Net Zero Review, really to sort of take forward some of the missions that were set out in that review. You might remember there were 10-year missions with the intention of establishing a sort of continuity, consistency, certainty of policy frameworks for the future. And time has moved on in ways that I couldn't have possibly imagined when the coalition was set up. On the one hand, we've seen the government sort of commit to many of the recommendations, over 100 of the 129 recommendations in the Net Zero Review, but then also to sort of pull back on some of that long-term commitment towards driving forwards change, with rollbacks on electric vehicles, on clean heat, on energy efficiency. Whereas at the same time, we've seen a Labour Party in opposition commit now to a mission-based approach on delivering net zero. So I've been delighted with the impact the report's had. What we intended to do with the coalition was to sort of maintain that focus, also to demonstrate by working with companies, organizations and businesses that provide that voice to demonstrate that net zero is not a cost. Of course, it's a challenge, but it is above all an opportunity for the UK, its regions and communities to identify where as the UK we can create new markets, new economies, to grow businesses, to create jobs, inward investment and growth. And we've published several reports through our networks. We have the Buildings Network, the Local Government Network that have published reports on identifying how to empower local communities and regions to deliver better on net zero policy, to also focus on how to reduce emissions both in retrofit our existing buildings and new buildings. The power generation report out of Crossroads that's been launched today actually covers 4 of the 10 missions in the net zero review. So what we did was to bring together the renewable sector, both wind, onshore, offshore, solar, together with the nuclear sector, together with those working on grid and infrastructure, which after all was the #1 sort of mission challenge in the net zero review. We have seen with this thing called a general election about to take place in a week's time, a real focus between the parties on what the future of a net zero grid will look like. Both parties have committed to that net zero grid, but have very different visions, not just around the time in which it should be delivered, whether it's 2030 or 2035, but also the focus of the role of government and the state in identifying how to deliver this on time and on budget. And while I'm going to hand over to Dan shortly to talk in more detail about some of the pathways that we've identified as being absolutely critical for delivering on either a 2030 or 2035 net zero grid mission, what we've tried to do in this report is set out 5 distinct pathways where we need to take action urgently. The Net Zero Review not just set out sort of policy recommendations. My experience as a politician is you've got to also ground that in a timeline and hold a government accountable to whether they're going to deliver on that temporal period. Again, this report sets out a pathway across several critical areas that we see as essential for delivering a net zero grid, and that a net zero grid will fail unless these pathways are met. But we need to take action both in the first 100 days of a new government, within the first year of a new government, and eventually also within the next 5 years. And you may have noticed that this report today is being launched exactly on the 5th anniversary of the UK becoming the first G7 country to sign net zero into law. Thanks for those who attended the reception with Australia's Climate Ambassador Kirsten Tilley yesterday, also to celebrate that. That was fantastic to have 53 separate jurisdictions represented by embassies from across the world. But even at that reception, it demonstrated that net zero is here to stay. There's no turning back, because net zero is now a global phenomenon. When I signed net zero into law as energy minister, I simply would have anticipated 93% of global GDP, 80% of all countries having signed net zero into law. But the impact that we're now seeing is obviously in that new net zero economy. It grew by 9% in the UK alone last year. You know, if I was in the Treasury, if I looked at all the sort of, the spreadsheets, I would put my chips on net zero, recognizing that opportunity it's going to provide. We saw for the first time, $3 trillion invested in renewable energy, making that sort of the most investable proposition globally compared to fossil fuels. And even in the manufacturing industries, $200 billion invested in renewable manufacturing technologies. So I see this as a moment of hope, of opportunity. Yes, there will be challenges. Yes, there are barriers that are currently placed, and that's what the report and the panel is going to discuss today. But we can turn these opportunities, these challenges into opportunities. We can look at these barriers and how to incentivize a net zero grid for the future. And this is what the report's about. We hope you enjoy reading it. Please do share it and socialize it. We've tried as best possible to reflect the views of communities working in the renewables, the nuclear industry, to make sure that we can amplify your voice through this report. But I'm very much looking forward now to introducing Dan McGrail, and then we've got a fantastic panel. I'm going to start from the end because Catherine Bennett from the High Value Manufacturing Catapult has to leave early, so I'm going to ask Catherine to address us first. But then we have also Chris Stark, who people may remember obviously as being a Chief Executive of the Committee on Climate Change. He's now moved to become the CEO of Carbon Trust, and thank you, Chris, for joining us. Michel Breckelsbauer, Vice President of Strategy at Last Energy. Last Energy being one of the organizations who've been part of the power generation network. They focus on micro generation of nuclear power for remote sites. Really exciting sort of prospect that potentially has the opportunity to deliver power for the future and reduce demand off the grid. Mark Owen Lloyd, also Director of Photovolt Development Partners. And Mark, thank you also for your sponsorship of this event today. It's greatly appreciated, and Photovolt have been part of the power generation network also. But I'm now going to hand over to Dan to give a bit more meat to the bone of what the report has set out before I'm going to sort of turn then to Catherine, and then also finally get a discussion going amongst the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Conduit. This is, as well as being a superb venue, is also the home to my organisation, Renewable UK, which is the UK's largest clean energy trade body. We represent about 500 companies across mainly the wind energy sector, but also tidal, marine, storage, networks. And it's also the home of Solar Energy UK, which is who share this building with us. So, and I think also the home of Carbon Tracker, who are one of the members of the coalition. So, so thank you for that. So, it's a very much clean energy hub emerging here in the centre of Covent Garden. I want to sort of set out a little bit, why this being part of this report and part of this coalition was important to me. I am an environmentalist and very much care about the net zero agenda, but I must admit at my core, I'm also an industrialist, and I worked for one of the world's largest technology companies for a long time. And I do believe that, and one of the things that Chris's original Mission Zero review sets out very clearly is just how much net zero is the economic opportunity of our generation. And there are many disruptive trends in the world, and there's a lot of talk at the moment about the impact of things like generative AI on how that might affect the world of work. But in some respects, the subject of renewable energy, clean energy, and the enabling infrastructure that we need to build to make that happen is very much a kind of a classic industrial renewal opportunity, and that inspires me because it means that it can create so many good, meaningful jobs, not only in the UK but around the world, and so many long-lasting and enduring investment opportunities. I want to say a couple of words of thanks, first of all, to the Mission Zero Coalition, everyone who contributed to the report. I want to thank also Grace from Chris's team, who's been really instrumental in pulling this together, and to Jonna from my team, who's also been very closely involved. So thank you to both of you. In the context of this election and as Chris just highlighted, the sort of the 2030 or 2035 context, for me, there's an important point which is kind of irrespective of which of those pathways you go down. Speed is of the essence. This is complicated. The reforms that are needed are nuanced. This report and the findings of this report are not exhaustive. It's impossible in many respects to be exhaustive because we have evolving complex challenges to deal with, and we're going to need to continually iterate and work. But one thing is clear to me is that if you want to have speed as the essence, then you need to make sure that when we emerge into a new government in a week's time, that the process is not one of reassessment or analysis of the pathways, but very clearly about getting on with the job and being cautious about deeply technocratic market reforms and things which may eventually lead to hiatus. So we need to get on with everything, but also we also should see decarbonising the grid very much as a moving challenge. And I'll just set a couple of thoughts on why that is, but you need to see it in the context of decarbonising and electrifying everything, not just the grid itself. And why? Well, in 2023, we added on average 1,300 electric vehicles to the UK's roads every single day. Now, that rate is only going to increase over time. We've got 41 million cars on the road in this country, so the transport sector is going to create huge demand. And so, in other words, just to stand still, we need to build the equivalent of one modern, large onshore wind turbine every week, just to stand still in the progress of reaching net zero. So that's like, analogous to climbing a mountain where the summit keeps growing. So the slower we go, the further away the destination gets. So speed is absolutely of the essence. And therefore, I really want to sort of set out this mantra with politicians and government officials of very much this: we need to move into an era of delivery. This is all about delivery and consistent, repeatable, predictable deployment of various different technologies, almost to the point where, and forgive me for saying this, but almost to the point where it becomes a bit boring. It needs to be predictable and almost as a rhythm. So we identified as a network 5 different pathways, which, as Chris said, are cross-cutting. These are things which need to be reformed, irrespective of whether you're in wind or solar or nuclear. And these are so we identified the topic of supply and demand and the grid associated with that. We identified the subject of planning and consenting, which is affects everybody. The skills that are needed. The investment environments that are needed, and the topic of digitalization. And there are recommendations in the report set in the context of 100 days, 1 year and 5 years for the government. I'm going to pick out a few of these, and this isn't exhaustive, so just a few of these, which some of which are closer to my heart than others. So I'll start with one which is very close to my heart, which is within the first 100 days of a new government, we need to end the ban on onshore wind farms in England, and that is a really important signal to all technologies, because we have a very lopsided system there. We need to make sure that the government stimulates markets this summer with an attractive CFD round, which drives in the investment into multiple technologies. And the government should commission a comprehensive skills and a workforce plan across the energy sector, not only looking at the demands of new industries and emerging industries, but working clearly on how to transition high carbon industries and build on the work of existing things like the Green Jobs Delivery Group, not repeat it. And it should set clear targets for things like long duration storage, and set up as a PAN technology long duration storage task force. Sorry, not long duration, just a storage task force in general. We don't have clear frameworks around that. And we should give the planning and consenting bodies the resources they need to upskill and identify the talent that they need, because this is a common subject irrespective of where you are. Within a year, we should have the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan published, and this will very much create the basis for all future planning decisions and investment. It needs to be enshrined in law, so it has a very clear reference point for all future planning decisions. We should, excuse me, ensure full alignment of net zero across all government departments, so it's not simply the job of DESNZ, but it is the job of all the government departments to deliver. And we should move the subject of the review of electricity market arrangements into an incremental and progressive framework for improvement, rather than a transformational one, which could risk significant hiatus in investment in the short term. And finally, conduct a full, thorough review of what has been a very successful policy, the contract for differences. It should be examined to see how it can be continuously improved, and that should be completed within 1 year. And over the term of the Parliament, we need to identify that the priority is the build out of transmission and distribution networks at scale. We need to see significant progress on this subject, and that needs to be very much a mission-led subject. We should establish and execute a national energy storage strategy. We should complete a full overhaul of the planning system, considering more radical reforms such as building more centralised centres of competence around certain energy technologies, rather than leaving planning bodies or at local level with an absence of knowledge or access to skills to be able to consent well. We should have a clear pathway for access to sites for SMRs, and we should ensure that the policy of the home building plans of the nation also make sure that we deliver one of the largest power stations in the country's history by making sure that building regulations incorporate solar very, very clearly and prescriptively. And finally, build a four nations approach to a recruitment campaign for skills across the country, really inspiring and engendering net zero as a mainstream career pathway for young people, and hopefully inspiring their parents to promote it as well, going forward as a long-term career. So these are just some examples of the recommendations of the report. It's not exhaustive, but really do encourage you all to read it. It's been genuinely a huge learning experience to be involved in it, and I'm very grateful to you all. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan. I'm delighted now to introduce Catherine Bennett, who I've known for a long time. He's absolutely committed to the transition and is CEO of the High Value Manufacturing Catapult that's doing so much to think through along a wide range of technologies, how to deliver as best possible a net zero grid. So Catherine, thank you very much. I know you have to leave, so I probably won't have time to ask you questions, but thank you so much for contributing.
Thank you, Chris, and amazing, the 5-year anniversary, and congratulations for all you've done on that. Just as I was listening to the talk just now, it reminded me, I had a boss once who said, enough of this green bean counting, Catherine. Thank goodness we've moved on from that. So as Chris said, I'm the CEO of the High Value Manufacturing Catapult. We're one of 9 catapults that were created by the government back in 2011. And Chris worked with us very closely when he was Science Minister. Jessica's here from the Digital Catapult as well. We've got other colleagues in different catapults who really focus on net zero too. So the manufacturing is the industry that I'm focusing on, and you may say, gosh, that's a sector that really needs to get its act together on net zero challenges, which is why we're very, very happy to be part of this coalition. So we have 7 different centres spread around the UK who are based in various parts of clusters of industrial strength. And the job of the catapults is to convene business and academia together to try and find those early stage solutions that could then turn into commercialisation. And clean energy, net zero, is absolutely one of our driving imperatives. So we're focusing on how we can help manufacturing in the UK decarbonise. Now, we did a survey recently with Innovate UK, our funder, and disappointed to say that about 70% of the manufacturing sector say they're really not sure they're ready for net zero. So, you know, we need to get our skates on, and we need to help them with that. So, you know, as Dan just said, there's real struggles in terms of the electricity distribution networks. It's all very well for us to say to manufacturers, you need to do this, you need to do that. But, you know, if the whole infrastructure isn't ready, then we need to obviously work together clearly. Dan also mentioned about the millionth electric vehicle was registered. We've got the new gigafactory opening in Somerset in the next few years. People here are probably much more knowledgeable than I, but we're working very closely with the wind sector in terms of continuing to help that form an even higher part of the percentage of electricity generation. And as Chris said, there's so many opportunities for business. You know, this is an economic opportunity for the country, and that's what we at the Catapults are all about, enabling that, you know, launching activities that can help businesses understand that it's an economic imperative for them to really focus on sustainability. And offshore wind is a great example on that. Some of you probably know that we have some amazing manufacturers who build the turbines, but we want to get more work in the UK supply chain and help, as Dan said, when the onshore agreement is made, that we can really be sort of match fit for helping there to be more in the supply chain. So what are we doing immediately? So there's some short-term things that the Catapult are focusing on, and of course helping manufacturers use their existing technology and just maybe a few tweaks in terms of improving their systems. They can come in and have a look at our sites and look at some demonstration production lines on how they can use more robotics, more digital, of course, in terms of proving their systems. And efficiency is a challenge, but again, it helps the bottom line if you get it right. There's also an issue maybe potentially about looking for more clustering about supply for industrial sectors. It could be a great bonus if you can get that right, done on a geographical level. I completely agree with what Dan said, though, about getting the 4 nations to work together. We're spread around the 4 nations, but obviously any changes that are made in the infrastructure for the businesses that we deal with, it needs to be reliable, and, you know, obviously we know it costs a lot of money. We're one of the leading nations on green energy technology. Obviously, there's USA, China, South Korea, etc., and our friends in Europe. But we need to continue to play our part. We need to continue to invest, and we know part of that also relates to investment from the city, so we're working with them. So across the 7 centres, which I mentioned earlier, we're working on hydrogen, working on wind, working on nuclear. Michelle and I were just talking industrial electrification, and we endeavour to help develop solutions and systems working across those different parts of the green energy industry to see, you know, how can you learn from each other. One example, one of our centres is Warwick Manufacturing Group, part of the University of Warwick, and they helped set up, as part of the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, the Faraday Battery Challenge, and that helped set up a thriving battery industry. We can always do more, to help with the supply chain, etc. But those are some of the opportunities we're working on the short term. Medium term, we're doing a lot of work on carbon accounting, helping manufacturers making that step in terms of certification and ensuring that they're measuring the right thing to help them meet the net zero challenges. So those are just some of the top things I wanted to cover this morning.
Well, Catherine, I'm really grateful for the opportunity for you to be here. I recognise you've got to leave. You probably do need to go now, I imagine, to get across London. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity for you to be here, and thank you so much for the work that High Value Manufacturing Catapult has done, and for anyone who's obviously looking to scale up or partner or collaborate, I would recommend being in contact with the Catapult network. As Science Minister, I saw all the Catapults, and they provide a great opportunity to deliver on the opportunities for the transition. So, Catherine, please do leave it. We won't. You came here and out of your way, so thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.
I'm going to turn now to running along the panel for everyone to give sort of opening remarks before we get into a wider discussion. I'm delighted now to introduce somebody who was absolutely instrumental in providing so many of the frameworks by which even our own report has decided to sort of create its pathways. Of course, it's Chris Stark, He's now CEO of the Carbon Trust and doing far more work internationally as well as in the UK. But Chris also was, until recently, was the chief executive of the Committee on Climate Change, which I think everyone recognises internationally as being the sort of jewel in the crown of the UK's sort of transition set up on the back of the Climate Change Act, which has enabled us to have that framework, that data, and that approach to identifying where are the gaps, where are the emissions, what needs to be done further, faster. I know that the progress report might have just come out, and your tenure is going to come out, I think, on the 18th of July. For me, it's the sort of Bible when it comes to looking at where we are in the UK. So I'm so grateful for the work that Chris has done, and delighted you could be here today, Chris. Thank you very much, and really keen to get your views and observations on where we are with the transition and a net zero power grid.
Well, thank you, Chris. Chris and I occasionally share a platform, and the annoying thing is we have the same initials, work in the same area, and we're both called Chris. So happily, we rarely disagree. So it's the 5-year anniversary for Chris today, or last night. It's actually the 6th anniversary for me. So it was about 6 years ago that we got the commission not to look at net zero. It's worth remembering a bit of history here. We did a bit of a song and dance with one of Chris's predecessors, Claire Perry then, not to look at net zero, but instead to look at whether we had the right target for our obligations under the Paris Agreement in the UK. And that happened about 6 years ago. And you might remember in those days, in 2050, we had an 80% target for 2050. So we were aiming to reduce emissions by 80%. And the problem with an 80% target is that literally everyone thinks they're in the 20. So the kind of challenge of looking at that was what we took up. And we spent a pretty active 6 months looking at whether it was time to change that target, what we felt the right target was. And we came up with the goal of net zero by 2050. We did an enormous piece of work at the Climate Change Committee on illustrating what 2050 would look like. And after a bit of wrestling within government, Chris then signed that into law, and I'm very much glossing over what would have been a far more difficult process internally, not least with Philip Hammond in the Treasury. We then moved on to looking at how you hit that goal by 2050, and that is, of course, a far more interesting question, and that was the point I wanted to come to next. Because we did some work in 2021 at the Climate Change Committee to illustrate 5 different pathways to the goal of net zero by 2050. And one of the critical elements in each of those 5 scenarios, each of which were very different, was that around the middle of the 2030s, regardless of which scenario you follow, the critical path takes you through a zero carbon electricity system. Really important to say, not 0 grams of CO2 in the electricity systems. I don't think that's necessary, but for the majority of the year, except when the electricity system is under a lot of stress, you might have a doldrum period the last 4 weeks, for example. But for the majority of the time, we felt it was possible to reach zero carbon and to have a zero carbon electricity system. And indeed, in each of those 5 pathways, it was around the same date, which tells you that it is actually really important that we hit that goal. Now, why did we say at that stage and recommend in 2021 that the government should set a goal to hit that target by, we said, 2035? Well, mainly because I think it's such a big offer to the people and the businesses who live and operate in this country. Because what you're saying in 2035, if we hit that goal, is plug in your electrical device, your electrical technology, whatever it is, stop worrying about it, is zero carbon. And that is such an important part of the narrative on the journey to net zero, because it is, just as Dan said earlier, it takes us on a far clearer path to electrifying the economy, and that being a kind of really, really critical part of building a more productive economy, one that is aligned with net zero. And the third stage of my story coming up to date is that last year, one of the last reports that I oversaw at the Climate Change Committee was also one of the hardest reports that we produced, which was to look at what kind of power system we would have in 2035 and try and model a full year of the power system in a world where we have increased the electricity demand, just as Dan said. We have much more electrical demand on the system from heat pumps and electric vehicles. And we wanted to model a world where it was a difficult year. So we actually modeled using real weather data and stress tested it by having a 4-week period without wind, what kind of power system we would have. What do we learn from that? We learned that it's possible. We didn't put a cost on it, but it looked very much cost effective to achieve that. You need to throw up, of course, a lot of new renewable low carbon electricity supply, and that is mainly wind. You need grid, you need interconnection, you need flexibility in demand, which comes from, in the main, having heat pumps and electric vehicles on the system, but connected smartly. And you need to crack open this question of long duration storage. And actually that is one of the really critical elements in allowing us to have the extent of renewable generation that we will need for that net zero power system. In our view, that's probably long duration energy storage. Models love hydrogen as being the answer to that, and it may not be the right answer, but it's such a useful energy store because it is also a way of using electrolysis instead of constraining off what would otherwise be a huge offshore wind fleet at that stage. There are other long duration energy storage technologies that we brought into that too. And the key thing in all of this is, if you want to pull that off, and I think we should want to pull that off, we don't need a kind of central plan for that. I mean, you could try and do it that way. What we need is a central coordination of that so that we get that going at the pace and the scale that's required. And we pointed out at that stage that that is not at all what we have at the moment. And sadly, we still have a situation where we are still moving far too slowly to achieve that. Now, very final point from me, Labour want to do that by 2030. Can it be done by 2030? Well, there's no physical barrier to doing it, but there are lots of institutional barriers. And that, I think, is the challenge. And I am extremely pleased to see Labour put that 2030 goal in there, because I think Ed Miliband calls it a stretch target. It is certainly a stretch target to decarbonise power by 2030. But the real reason I think it's important to have it in there is because if we're going to get anywhere close to that, we're going to have a different approach within government and the institutions to make that work. A far, far more dynamic approach that reaches out into the private sector and gets things going much more quickly. It is also the key to doing something far more interesting, which goes beyond the power sector into things like industry decarbonisation, the job story that you talked about, the regional regrowth that we need to see as part of net zero. A lot of that we can get going quickly too. Now, I suspect we will have a Labour administration, and I suspect they will come in as that one of their key missions, as that being one of their key missions. But that, I think, can be tremendously motivating if we get that right. And everything that I've said very clearly is reflected in the report that has been published this morning. And let me commend it to you, because the work that Dan and Chris has done spells that out far more eloquently than I have just now. It is absolutely a blueprint for what the next government needs to do, particularly in the next 100 days, to get that going. And I recommend it. You should all have a look at it. I'll stop there, Chris. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chris, for those kind words, and we give Chris a round of applause for his comments. I'd now like to turn to Michel Breckersbauer from Last Energy. As I said, Michel's been part of the power generation network, contributing to our, I think, 11 roundtables that we held as part of the evidence process. She's now going to sort of give her remarks on the international space. As I mentioned, this word net zero is viral. We are now in a net zero race, but also where is the opportunity for future technologies, particularly in nuclear energy, to help deliver a net zero grid and provide opportunities to both reduce demand and at the same time incentivize additional capacity on the grid. So Michel, over to you.
Thank you so much, Chris. As you can tell by my accent, I am not British. Last Energy is based in Washington, D.C. in the United States, but I've had the pleasure of working really closely with the nuclear sector here in the UK since we established our operations here in 2021. My background is in engineering and public policy. I worked for many years in government in DC, but I've worked just as long with government here in the UK, and I've been really impressed by the ambition, but we have, as I think everyone recognizes, quite a way to go in order to meet the challenge of the commitment that was made 5 years ago. Last Energy is a really interesting company in that we were actually founded first as a research organization studying climate technologies and which could be the most impactful on addressing climate change in the near term and really getting us to meet net zero. We were founded back in 2019, right around the time when the UK was making these commitments, and it was a clear signal to us as a US business that we needed to take this market seriously and that it had the potential to be our first market for deployment of our technology, and where we could truly make the transformational change that we thought needed to happen in the nuclear sector. So we spent the first 2 years of our company really just studying nuclear technology, deployments, historical, not just of nuclear, but also of the wind and solar industries, of oil and gas, biomass, waste to energy, trying to learn the lessons that these other sectors had clearly figured out, but that nuclear just wasn't delivering on, right? I mean, nuclear, if you're familiar with this technology, you might understand that from its sheer physics alone, we have an orders of magnitude advantage in terms of being able to provide electricity at a very small footprint, but a huge bang for your buck. But we just had stagnated as a sector. So when we studied these different business models, we came up with essentially a playbook that borrowed from all of these different sectors and turned that into what eventually spun out to be Last Energy, the commercial company. So as Chris kind of mentioned in his introduction to me earlier, we found a really critical niche in that nuclear not only provides electricity, but it provides heat. And if we're going to decarbonize industry, we're going to need to have both of those critical elements for manufacturing, for data centers, for anyone who needs that baseload 24/7 clean electricity and heat power source. But manufacturers, these facilities exist all over the country, all over the world. They aren't always next to large bodies of water or along the coast. They need reliability that sometimes the grid can't provide. So we need to look at how we can bring this type of technology, this baseload technology, to these industrial off-takers. And that's why we focused on what we call micro-nuclear. For us, that's a 20 megawatt power plant, so very, very small, but that is completely standardized and can be mass manufactured so that we can build the number of units that meet the demand and scale up to meet the demand of individual customers behind the meter for them to decarbonize their industries. And so that's kind of where we focus. I am the only nuclear person on this panel, so I do want to give a shout out to the rest of the sector, right? Because this is, as I mentioned, just the physics-based viewpoint on nuclear. It's a critical technology for reaching net zero and decarbonization, not just behind the meter for the types of off-takers that we work with, but at the grid scale as well. SMRs, which are not really small, but have grid applications, have applications for larger industrial complexes, and then of course large nuclear plants like the Hinkley Point C project that the government has been committing to and is well underway, and then hopefully we'll see Sizewell C as well come to fruition in the next few years. But that's our perspective, right? That the nuclear has a critical role to play, that if we're going to wean ourselves off of oil and gas, that nuclear is going to be that technology that supports the transition, coupled with, of course, renewables, solar, wind, geothermal, all these other sources. I will say one other piece from the international perspective. Last Energy is again, US-based, but we're not just working in the UK, we're active in several other countries in Europe. And the demand that we're beginning to see from the private sector for this type of solution is really incredible. That's what attracts us to a market, right? We sign power purchase agreements directly with off-takers. We then take on the back of those PPAs, we go raise private sector project finance so that we don't have to be a burden on the taxpayer, right? We aren't a burden on the government. We are a private sector business working with private sector manufacturers, raising private capital to deliver for net zero for those industries. And I think that type of business model is also really critical. It's what we've borrowed from my colleagues in the renewables space, and it's really important to have that type of innovation really highlighted and supported by government going forward. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I'm now going to turn to Mark Owen Lloyd. Mark, as I mentioned, from a photo of Old Development Partners. involved in sort of major solar projects across the UK. Obviously, one of the recommendations of the Net Zero Review was a 70 gigawatt solar target by 2035 and the establishment of the Solar Task Force. I'm delighted to see, I think, Chris in the audience. Nice to see you from the task force, and obviously keen that those task force, when the recommendations are fully made public, that we can get on with delivering solar as well. But Mark is going to give his reflections on the opportunities and challenges for that deployment and what it needs to look like in the future. Mark.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris. So my name is Mark Owen-Lloyd. I work for a company called Photovolt Development Partners. We are a Berlin-based, privately held company which has been building solar farms since 2006. Built a gigawatt of solar in Japan, and in 2019 the company moved its focus to the UK, opening in the UK, although we remain, our engineers and support staff are all in Berlin. Dan rehearsed very well the themes and challenges that face renewables developers. But if I just focus on actually why we were attracted to the UK, and then why what challenges we've experienced since and I should mention the project that we've launched was Botley West Solar Farm, which is an 840 megawatt solar NSIP, nationally significant infrastructure project, doing a DCO in Oxfordshire, runs for 18 miles from north of Woodstock all the way down to Botley in the west of Oxford, and will deliver enough power, if consented, to power 330,000 homes. So it's a really significant thing for Oxfordshire, which has only one generation facility at the moment, which is Didcot gas-fired power station in the south of the county, which has been converted by RWE to being a peaking plant. Currently, they've demolished the coal plant. But just to set in context what we're facing, when Didcot was built in the 60s, people lay down in the road to stop the lorries coming through. When they proposed demolishing the cooling towers 2 years ago, they lay in the road to stop them getting through to demolish the cooling towers. So there's a leap of imagination. There's an acceptance of change that you need to get people to go for. And that's why the work of those who work in policy, like the Chris's and Dan and Chris from Solar Energy UK, are so important, because the opportunity is there, the target is there, it's private capital that's being deployed. Grid, which comes in for a great deal of criticism, has responded within the constraints of the grid code, which state that it may only respond to customer demand. It may not plan itself, which seems an extraordinary way of planning an energy transformation. But Grid, who, for example, before 2015 were getting 5 connection applications a year, they got 58 last December alone. So you can see what pressure that's put them under, and they've responded to that. It's one of the areas I cover, is grid connections. We now have 10 gigawatts of grid connections in the UK, and we'll be launching DCOs over the next 4 years. And then we come to planning. Now, one of the reasons PVDP came to the UK, apart from the fact that it's so renewables friendly, and there was a desire to build, and there was the government targets, which were expressed through the national policy statements, which the government, which has another week or so of its life, published their latest ones or derogated them in January. Really powerful statement, EN1 through to EN5, which set out the renewable targets and what the parameters were for development consent orders. So that when the MD called me from Japan and said, what's it like? How can we do this? And I explained to him. But the challenge of the development consent order is its enormous expense and its time. When it was first launched, the Planning Act 2008, a DCO would take approximately 2 years. I got the grid connection for Botley West in 2021. We launched the DCO with the first consultation in 22. We're on target for a consent or decision in 26, and we have a connection date of 28. So 8 years from start to finish. Now, if we're going to meet those 2030, 2035 targets, that's a real push under the current consenting regime. And they're enormously time consuming because of the number of surveys, the number of people, and the consultations you have to do. Now, in the last 2 years, I also have to run the communications part of our DCO campaign. So I've stood in parish halls all over Oxfordshire in 20 events that we've held, the non-statutory and statutory consultation, and held some interesting and very challenging conversations with locals. And the overriding message that I've received from them is that they don't really know what is happening to the UK's energy system. I'm old enough to remember when the government had public information films and the Central Office of Information, and it would communicate very clearly what is happening. And again, that is why the policy area is so important. Most conversations would start with the words, "I have an electric car," and you think, well, yes, so you're part of the problem, actually, because we need to start generating electricity to satisfy your need to charge your car and to deliver electricity in a completely different way than we do it now at different times. In Australia, for example, where they've got an enormous amount of solar, their peak off-peak has flipped, as you'd expect in Australia. So it's actually off-peak during the day, and the peak is at night when there's no solar. So all these things are happening. I remember the first event we held in Woodstock, a woman said to me, "Why are you doing this to our fields?" And so I began my explanatory spiel, and she said, "But we have plenty of generation. This is just a money-making scheme for the benefit of your organisation." I said, "Well, you do know we've closed all our coal stations apart from Ratcliffe, and our nuclear power stations are mostly closed by 28. And she was shocked. She had absolutely no idea. So I think education and spreading the message of what is happening is really important. And since starting work on this, and my background is as an energy trader, so I was hired to do the connections and to trade the electricity once we generate it. I've seen from my time when I was at E.ON UK running their power and carbon trading, the economic benefit that can come from policy. I was hired by E.ON to start trading the EUAs, European allowances, under the European Emissions Trading Scheme. And that was an extraordinary thing. That is now the second most liquid energy commodity future, the EUA, after Brent crude oil. So, and that was created from nothing by policymakers. You can see the economic effect that's had. If you see the economic effect that a large solar farm could have, where we're planning to put it in Oxfordshire, in a grid that is at capacity, where all the local authorities have declared climate emergencies, and where there are areas of unemployment in North Oxfordshire which we can address. We're already working with the local technical college and the local enterprise partnership. So there was a huge economic opportunity here, which we could seize in batteries and in solar and hopefully onshore wind. And it doesn't necessarily cost the incoming government anything to do that. So there is a huge opportunity there, but the danger is if we don't explain to people, they will just view people like me who come with solar panels, and I will as a threat. And again, turning to how important the policy is, in the last 6 months, with the election looming, the current government has delayed and kicked into the long grass 2 solar DCO decisions, Sunnica and Mallard Pass. They did that for political expediency because they believed it was a vote loser and the local Tory MPs were in marginal seats. Now, it doesn't sound a big thing. There's a general election. That will all disappear afterwards. But don't underestimate the effect that has on the people who are taking the risk, who are putting the capital in to make the planning applications. If they see more of that, they will go elsewhere because there are plenty of other countries who are electrifying their grid where you can go and do this. So consistency and firmness of policy is really, really important. And I will stop my rant there and put it over to the floor. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thanks indeed to all of our panel for their sort of opening remarks and comments. We're now going to sort of turn to the opportunity for a discussion, a Q&A. So if you do have any sort of questions you'd like to ask, ideally all of the panel rather than one person specifically, do keep in mind a question and raise your hand in a moment. I'm going to use the chair's prerogative to ask the first question, and then we'll sort of see how we get on in terms of audience participation. We're running this till 10:15, but then we'll have the room till 11. So if we don't get to your question, do come and sort of socialise and talk about it with us afterwards. We have the terrace as well to have coffees and refreshments after the launch. I wanted to sort of lead on this question of 5 years. The report being published today, exactly 5 years to the date from the UK signing net zero into law. It's also pretty much 66 months. It's about 2,000 days until we get to 2030. So I wanted to ask the panel in turn, in the last sort of 5 years, what have you got as far as you thought the UK was going to get? Are there areas that maybe we've gone further that surprised you, or are there particular areas where we have not achieved things that you definitely thought might have happened in the 5 years? I think it's important to reflect on, we've got this 5-year potential 2030 mission, but seeing it in a historical context, grounded in the reality, I think is important. So I'm going to start with Mark on the back. Is there maybe projects you might have thought might have been in the ground and operational in 5 years and are not? But I think to get that sort of sense, and then I'm going to take some questions to the audience.
Not really. The grid has changed enormously in that time. They've completely transformed their connections procedure. They've altered the way connections are managed once they're offered, because there was a real problem with connections banking. You mentioned last night the 700 gigawatts, most of which is pretty much fantasy. It will never be built. So that has pleased us. I think the real problem, and those who are involved in rooftop solar will say yay to this, is that the local planning system is, and we know that from the housing issues, is completely unfit for purpose. All our local authorities have declared climate emergencies, our host local authorities. None of them have done anything about that. For example, setting aside in their local plan, they don't actually have a local plan of that, where they might encourage solar, where they might allocate areas for solar. So I think local planning is an area that needs addressing really, really quickly.
Michelle, 5 years on, are there things that have taken you by surprise, or things that you're disappointed by, and how does that reflect on the next 60 months?
Well, I will first say that you at least have an energy policy that has been, or an energy strategy that's been communicated well. It's something that we don't really truly have in the United States, and so that is a very positive thing. But certainly in nuclear, I think it always goes slower than you want, and that's what we have to fix. I think 5 years ago, there was still a viable project proposed up at the Wilfa site in Wales. There, I think, were a few others as well around the country that are no longer on the table, if you will. We've seen lots of statements and launches and relaunches of bodies that have been set up to have really great ambition for delivering nuclear, but that ambition has become less and less focused on. We've also seen government, I think, be captured in many ways by just the amount of process and debate around large-scale nuclear and even SMR when we really could have just been getting on with it. I think from our perspective, right, we've tried to isolate the amount of reliance on government in terms of funding or true policy as much as possible, because I think, as has been said multiple times, right, the true issue here with delivering energy projects is the duration and the reliability of the schedule. And that's because we have to attract private investment, at least from the micronuclear side and from the renewables side. And so the more certainty that we can get from government on pathways either supported by government or the pathways where we are going alternative to government programs, that's really critical for us, and to bring in that capital, bring in that that support to actually deliver these projects. So that's been slightly disappointing, but of course I'm extremely optimistic and ambitious, and so it's been helpful to tamper my own expectations. But I still think that that we have a pretty strong pathway to delivering nuclear in this country, certainly before 2030.
Chris, looking back, surprises, disappointments, unexpected turns in the road?
Yeah, I think I might depart from my usual spiel here and say something positive. So absolutely shitloads has changed in the last 5 or 6 years. So let's be clear on that. I mean, when we did our report on net zero, there was it was very much a sort of shock and awe idea that we had to do this, that we were going to produce this report, but also say something about how you get to net zero. You know, this is like the first place anywhere in the world that had been able to illustrate that. And there was a typical reaction to that from the usual quarters about this being generally an impossible mission. I don't think that people feel that way anymore. So what I think, at the top level is that the whole of government has really accepted the need to do this thing, and in particular, my old department in government, the Treasury, has accepted it as a net zero as a sort of fundamental of the economy, which is an enormous shift. I think the other shift that's happened is that the corporate community has accepted net zero as a challenge that they want to take up, and the energy sector was already there. So lots have changed there, and you could go a bit deeper into that. I mean, I'm regularly in the pages of the Telegraph, and if you look back at the Telegraph's coverage of what we were saying about electric vehicles at the time, I was being held up as a sort of fantasist about moving to electrical transport. Broadly, things are moving in exactly the same way that we predicted it would 5 or 6 years ago, not helped by the fact that the Prime Minister made a very foolish speech on Downing Street last year, which has completely destroyed confidence in the consumer market and upset, of course, an automotive sector too. But those things are happening. But I think what I've learned over that period is that whilst that is an enormously important part, the changing the perception of net zero as being a fundamental, it has definitely occurred. It's much harder than I thought it would be to get those institutions that I talked about earlier in the right place. Just getting stuff in the ground, getting stuff done is just much, much harder than it should be. All of the issues that we've just heard about play out in other ways in other sectors too. And I've been saying recently when I've been talking, we're going to have to move from a period of sort of prophets like me, and I mean PH prophets here, who are sort of prophesizing the future, into pragmatism. So prophets to pragmatists is really the move that we've got to make, and it turns out that's much harder. So pragmatism means rolling up the sleeves, getting stuff done, and that's really what we need for net zero now. I could sit here for the next 2 or 3 hours and tell you all the benefits of net zero in 2050, but it's a sort of end state. Then we all know that that's good. The journey to it is tricky, and it won't be as perfect as we want it to be. And I think, in a sense, final comment from me, I feel a bit when I look back over the 5 years that we've been slightly like a rabbit in the headlights. Bloody hell is big, so let's just wait a bit and work it out what to do. Everything's now set up. We've got to get on with it, and pace over perfection is absolutely the way to move that forward.
And Dan, from your own sector, obviously a number of sort of recent disappointments, but also huge growth as well. Would you look back now and think from where you were in 2019 that you would expect where we are now today to be where we are, or would you look back and think actually this is a remarkable sort of success story?
It's a bit of a mixed response. I'm going to sort of look. I work in a long cycle industry, right? So it's quite perspective is often really quite hard to identify and work out exactly where you are. I'm going to start with sort of this, because I was thinking when Mark was speaking before about this climate emergency thing, right? And the dictionary definition of an emergency is a serious, unexpected, and often dangerous situation requiring immediate action. The wind farms, the offshore wind farms that will be auctioned this summer and probably commissioned in 2029 will be built on seabed leases that were issued when Gordon Brown was the Prime Minister. That isn't aligning with that definition of emergency in any way, shape, or form. So, you could look at it through one prism and go, we're miles away. Between 2017 and 2022, every offshore wind farm that received a DCO required the Secretary of State to overturn the recommendation of the Planning Inspectorate. So something's misaligned in policy. Mm-hmm. That's the bit that brings us down. The bit that brings us up is that when you try and apply perspective to it, what has happened in the last couple of years is some reasons for real optimism. One, the last big emergency we had, the pandemic, demonstrated that you can innovate your way institutionally to do huge emergency responses if you get the institutions performing well. And we need that kind of attitude towards net zero. No one would have believed that was possible. And secondly, even though it's a dark cloud on the horizon, the subject of war in the Ukraine and sort of geopolitical instability, what that has done is just prompted governments around the world and in Europe in particular to take emergency action. You know, Europe is going to be off Russian gas by 2027. That would have been inconceivable, you know, until people started to make decisive structural institutional changes. So you can do it, and we can do it. And we haven't seen the impact yet, really, of the national policy statements that were revised in January in consenting decisions. We haven't seen the impact, and I note that it was a bad, you know, moment, that speech that Rishi gave. But equally, we had a prime minister standing on the steps of Downing Street talking about grid. That's weird, but also brilliant. You know, so the fact that this stuff is in the mainstream, the second of Labour's 5 missions is around clean energy. So we should have cause for real optimism that if you apply perspective, the impact of the decisions that have been made over the last couple of years should mean that the acceleration starts to unfold in the next couple of years.
Excellent. Well, calls for hope. And I think that sort of positive note that's been struck by the panel slightly surprised me. I think sort of, you know, sometimes the media always gives this sort of doomerist approach, but as Chris said, that pragmatic ability to just get on with the job, not wait around for the perfect to be anything good, is exactly the sort of focus of where this report is coming from. Anyone in the audience like to ask some questions? I think what I'm going to do, because we've got sort of 10, 15 minutes, is take them in sort of groups of 3, and then hopefully we get as many people as possible. Gentleman right at the back was the first to get his hand up, so he can go first. And I'm going to bring in sort of Chris and then Scott.
Thanks very much. I'm Tom Luff from the Energy Systems Catapult. And thanks, Chris, for this event and also for the involvement that we've been able to have in the report. And actually also to the whole panel, really grateful for your efforts, because you're all doing a brilliant job to try and get us to this really formidable, through to this formidable challenge of net zero. The focus has very much been on sort of industrial benefits, which I think is right. In terms of the kind of the other side of it, of the opportunity for net zero to bring down costs for consumers and the cost of electricity, for example, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, because that's also a great opportunity, both for kind of consumers to benefit, but also for the wider economy if we can have cheaper power. And I guess the sort of the other side of that is that it's great to hear 2030 is technically feasible. How do we think we should balance those kind of really formidable challenges of achieving it? So that might mean, you know, building lots more pylons, which I assume it will to some extent. How do we challenge that with actually maybe we need to feel a bit of a pinch on changing the market so that, for example, we can get, you know, if you put in a SMR somewhere, you get cheaper power prices in that area, or the same with a wind farm or solar panels. So that kind of those kind of choices. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm going to bring in Chris Hewitt, CEO of Solar UK and chair of the Solar Task Force. So the mic coming just down here at the front, second row. Thanks.
Thank you. So Ian, I'm going to take a confident, not an optimistic, a confident perspective here. So if you want to look at the media, I'd advise you to read The Economist this week. The Economist has its front page, its main editorial, and a major feature on the exponential growth of solar across the world. I think that article really gets the speed of deployment, the speed of technology advancement in solar. The same is happening in batteries, the same is happening in EVs. So I'm really confident we can get there. My question to the panel, I think, and some of you touched on this already, is how do we help institutions, whether it's Ofgem, whether it's the distribution network operators, whether it's the Treasury, truly grasp the speed of innovation in the sector and design policy for present day technology, not the technology that was 10 years ago, yet alone the future innovations, because it's really happening very fast.
Thanks, Chris. And Scott, just in the front row here. Oh, great.
Thanks you all, and brilliant panelists as always. So my quick question is actually a practical one, and maybe interesting for you particularly, Chris, but how do you get cross-party buy-in to the report here, if we think that is important? And yeah, so what are the practical steps that we should be taking to do that?
Thanks, Eric. So we got a question on electricity costs, question on the role of how to empower and support innovation, and then a more pragmatic question about how do we make this fly with a new government, and also at the same time demonstrate that there is a cross-party opportunity. Who'd like to go first? Maybe if I can bring in Michelle, and then over to Chris, and then Mark.
I think I'll start with the second question. I mean, I think that that's on the developers in many ways, right? I mean, obviously there's a lot of amazing work that can be done by, the catapults and similar organizations to help regulatory bodies, permitting bodies, the grid, the government to understand. But I think ultimately we have to show by doing. Nuclear, right? Micronuclear is very different from a gigawatt scale power plant, right? If you think about applying proportional regulation, we should be able to license this technology in a much shorter time period. We should be able to receive development consent orders in a much shorter time period. And so I think that the innovation actually has to, and the convincing is going to have to be done by the organizations, by the developers themselves, right? And it's bringing the regulators, bringing these institutions along with us and showing them that there is another way is the critical piece. I think, what's great is that the way that these institutions have been set up makes them amenable to the types of arguments that we are going to be presenting to them. I think it's about matching our rationale and their ambition, and having civil servants and the people who are really the ones doing the work step up and recognize that they have a part in net zero too, but it's us who has to make them feel comfortable in sticking their necks out there.
Chris, bring you on some other questions.
Yeah, let me try and stitch together, if I can, those three things. So, I mean, on the consumer stuff, let me say something at the start of this. The single most important policy for decarbonising the UK economy, and indeed other parts of the world too, is to make electricity cheap. So it is a really, really important thing to do, because it will stop other policies, sector by sector, having to do all this heavy lifting that we see, for example, sort of pumping up heat pumps, if I can use that term, it's entirely the wrong way to describe it, giving these huge subsidies to technologies individually to try and get consumers to pick them up. It's just a lot easier if everything is cheaper, if it's electric. However, I want to be very cautious about this. When the work we did, and consistently over the 5 or 6 years that I was looking at this, shows you that it is going to be very difficult to make that happen over the next 5 to 10 years, because we've still got a hell of a lot of investment to do for net zero. So I think it would be very good if one of the kind of binding missions that the next government takes on is to look at that question of how we get electricity to be cheaper, certainly cheaper than gas, as quickly as possible for the consumer. And of course, there are tools and levers that we haven't pulled yet to make that happen, and it's very important that we do that. And we should be realistic about it, because I also think that in my experience of discussing this with actual people, if you say to them, look, the end state, or where we'll be in the next 5 to 10 years, is worth it for a host of reasons, they're more willing to listen to you when you say that the next 5 years might be more tricky. And we haven't done that either. So let me sort of then bring in the second point about the institutions that Chris raised. I absolutely think you can get people to work more quickly on this by giving them clearer coordination. And I have to say, I do think it's government's role to do that, to get that going well. And it will not happen at the required pace if we only look at the sort of technocratic policy making that was basically the way we've approached this so far. So I don't really think we've tried to do a sort of mission-based approach to get stuff going more quickly yet at all. And you raised the pandemic, Dan. We did do that with the vaccine task force, and I think that's basically what the playbook. I think you need to sit down, get the institutions around the table, and do that consistently and get them working properly. And I actually think that's really exciting to do that. And I think that dynamism is missing at the moment. So then the policies can come later, but I think we should front end it by looking at it in that way. And then the third question, I think that's the answer to how you mainstream this report, is that you offer the next government, I'm going to say it will be a Labour government, so we offer the Labour government, this report has within it something you can actually turn into something that can be implemented. And they want to do that thing. They want to get stuff going quickly. And they certainly want to tell a good story about cheap electricity. And I think we can help them with that. And the last thing I'll say on this is we need to give them a bit of enthusiasm to do that. and a bit of encouragement. It's so miserable, this discussion. We need to get onto it being exciting again. I mean, Dan and I were talking about the debate last night on it was terrible. It was a genuinely terrible discussion. The joy's not there in it. Let's get going on it. And that's basically, when I think back at the last 5-6 years, Chris, there was a lot of joy and excitement about the net zero stuff. And we all felt quite good about having a go at this. I think that is the kind of key, crucial element that's missing at the moment.
I'll take one more question from the audience, and then we're going to wrap up from the panel. I'm going to go, Stephen Dorrell actually at the back has got his hand up first, and then sort of.
Thank you very much, Chris. Very briefly, thanking you for the work you've done on all of this to get Mission Zero to this stage. My question is a simple political question, and it's in a sense, it's the mirror image of your question looking back. Looking forward, we have a government coming in 10 days' time with a commitment to deliver this mission by 2030, which sounds like the middle distance. Actually, it isn't. If you're a new government, you've got 2 years to make a difference. So my question is what have they got to do by Christmas this year to deliver by 2030? Christmas this year is 25% of the decision time for a new government, because once you're 2 years in, you're recovering your popularity. You've got to do it, and do it within the first 2 years. So what have they got to do by Christmas?
Thank you. And a final question from the lady just at the front in the second row. And then we're going to get the panel to wrap up their answers in their final closing remarks. And I'll start with Mark.
Hi, I'm Sophie from the Climate Agency. I wanted to say, ask, the UK is a little bit of an outlier at the moment because the mood music in Europe, potentially in America, certainly in France, where I come from, is very populist. And the populist message is net zero is going to be really expensive for individuals, it's going to be really expensive for industries and hold the sector back. What do we do? What is, I mean, it's clearly it's not something you believe, but it is a perception that's very strongly out there. It's going to be expensive, it's going to be difficult, it's going to go to SPAC, it's going to stop our, purchasing power. You'd mentioned cheap electricity, but that message hasn't really gone through. How do you answer this? And how threatening is it to the plans?
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to ask the panel now to take those questions in their final comments. I'll start with Mark and come back down the panel. Mark.
Cheap electricity, solar power is, people call it cheap green renewable power. It is the cheapest form of generation. How do you persuade people that? Well, for example, we're setting up a retail energy company at Botley West. We're going to sell the output from our solar farm to people who live in the host parishes, so they'll be able to sign up and get a 5% discount from the off-gem cap. As we develop, we'll widen that area. So tangible, you've just got to keep talking and persuading people, and also they've got to see it in action. There is currently no DCO-sized solar farm operating in the UK. The first that was consented, Cleeve Hill near Whitstable in Kent, is being constructed at the moment. From DCO to start of construction was 4 years. Why? So we need to do things faster. We need to show people that it is not just hot air. It's not just policy statements. It is real, and there are benefits, and also explain to them the dangers, the downsides. If we remain as we are while doing what we've done, because the UK's done an interesting thing, is it's decided to decarbonise, so it's shut the carbon, hasn't yet done the other side, which is to build the generation. So it could get very, very expensive if you do nothing. So, but you don't want to scare people, but you need to explain that. And as to cross-party, which is absolutely crucial, we've achieved that. Both the Lib Dem candidate and the Tory candidate in our constituency oppose us. So we've got cross-party consent. So there's the challenge. The answer is, again, talk and explain and show the economic benefit, because if the money flows, then they will all buy into it, I think.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting with these net zero policies is, yes, they have the potential to increase costs for manufacturers, like electricity grid prices going up, and that's also, though, creates opportunity for first-of-a-kind deployment. And that's where we've had a lot of benefit, right? First of a kind, our power plant capital cost is less than $100 million, right? That's why we're able to privately finance that. But it's really important to have an eye as a business also to how we're going to be able to decrease costs over time as we scale, as we approach high throughput manufacturing of these plants. And having the first set of customers is also really critical, right? These customers have to be bought in, not only in, I need net zero, I need baseload power, I need heat that has to be clean, but also I'm willing to be a first of a kind nuclear customer. And so it's a really interesting opportunity that is created out of the challenge that these industrial manufacturers are presented with because of the net zero transition. So yes, there is this challenge that can be seen as a challenge, but for us, we see it very much as a market making opportunity. And it allows us to be able to get to the place where we can then scale down those costs, deploy broader at scale for additional sectors beyond, data centers and manufacturers. Getting to the question in the back, and I completely agree with you. I think the momentum that we will have out of the change of government is so critical. I think the report outlines a lot of really fantastic recommendations for the first 100 days, so I definitely encourage you all to look at that. But from the nuclear perspective, right, I think that we just need, ideally, to have that true mind shift. We need to focus on delivery. We don't need to be picking winners and doing more competitions and doing more studies. We just need to be focusing on delivery. That means changing our institutions, our regulatory processes, our permitting processes to allow for innovation, allow for true market competition, lots of different business models, lots of different technologies. We'll see by 2030, who's able to make it to the finish line. Ideally, we have a lot of energy projects in that DCO pipeline across the technology space, not just nuclear, but we need to have that level of ambition from civil service and clear signals of that.
Chris.
So let me start with the question at the back, which I think is the really critical one. So if we do see that change of government, we will have to move enormously quickly. I mean, these things have got to move instantly, and I think that is what we will get. So I think the first month of the next government, Keir Starmer will want to move almost immediately into not saying this is what you're going to get, but this is what you're already getting. So, and one of the areas across his shadow cabinet that is most developed is the energy piece. So I think Ed Miliband probably has an idea of what he's going to do in that first month. So I would expect I used this term earlier, I'll use it again now, a shock and awe first month. I think there's some things that you can do in that first month that really matter. Dan mentioned earlier the AR6 auction. That is a first opportunity to change the game completely on offshore wind. We need onshore wind to be part of this mix, and there's a very quick way that you can bring that on too. We need to signal at least that we are going to look seriously at planning. Then we will have recess, and inevitably that requires a period over August. But then we have a King's Speech, and we know that the Labour Party are planning an Energy Independence Act as part of that first legislative programme. That is another opportunity to articulate how things are going to change very, very quickly. I think it's enormously important that we take those opportunities, because the narrative about this, the discussion that you will be having when you leave this room, needs to be positive about things moving quickly, or people won't believe it. And I think the belief thing is really important. We've all got to believe there is now more pace in the system. And that brings me then to the second question about what we do more broadly about the challenge of the politics, perhaps, if I might put it that way, on net zero. And that is the world I've been living in for quite some time now, and I have seen that shift happen. I'll say something controversial, if I might. It might be that net zero is not the right slogan for the next phase. Net zero is a really important target, because it's a scientific target. The global goal of net zero is just the point when global warming stops. And net zero CO2 we must reach, otherwise it's going to get pretty toasty on this planet. That does not mean that every single thing that we're doing is draped in a political slogan around net zero, and I think that is the challenge right now. And I actually think we've got to get beneath that into pointing out all the things that you get with net zero. So, lots of people in the country and around the world have different outlooks on these things. Energy independence, the security of the country, that is a reason to do net zero. It is more important and more motivating than net zero itself. Jobs in parts of the country that need it, far more motivating issue if you've got a program of investment that delivers that. You can go much further into other issues. I mean, the beauty of British landscapes is a thing that people really care about. It also is a really important part of the story for net zero too. I could go on, but I think we've got to be better at articulating the benefits of this. And my experience of when you do that with people who are skeptical about it is if you say, look, we are pursuing this thing for a different reason and it helps the climate, they are even more interested in seeing that happen. It's almost like net zero or climate as a sort of reinforcing reason to do it. So we aren't speaking to a lot of people at the moment who have those views. And I think the way of cracking this is to start articulating that better.
Thank you, Chris. Finally, Dan, any final reflections? Then we'll go finish and have the opportunity to talk amongst ourselves until 11.
I want to start at the front because I have a relevant anecdote. Yesterday I was in a board meeting together with all my peers from around Europe, and it was quite interesting. Sort of, the first discussion was about the impact of the EU elections and seeing a move to the right as significant growth in populist parties. Maybe not as bad as feared, I think it's fair to say. And then, of course, the context of the French elections starting this weekend. And then I was talking about, how the polls look for the UK, and I was thinking maybe we've kind of been through the cycle that is happening now in the rest of the European Union, because we were, probably, the polls suggest a moderate, centrist government will win, and we will have, a slightly different tone. So what do I make of that? What we've been just doing some polling recently of conservative and reform voters, and one of the things that we found is that actually net zero climate is not really high up on their list of concerns. They're concerned about lots of other things, but the parties concerned are using that to a certain extent as a wedge issue. But actually the people that they speak to actually respond quite well to things like energy security, energy independence. These topics are super important for many people. And we really need to sort of, I think, collect a little bit the movement around that as much as we talk about climate. It used to be that we had this trilemma thing, and we needed these trade-offs between different technologies. But clean energy now is the lowest cost, it is the most secure, and it is the most obviously environmentally friendly. So we should be absolutely bold and be optimistic and positive about that, because it's a pretty undefeatable argument. And I think coming to the back, I think, and it also speaks a little bit to Chris's question, is, to me, I think mission-based approach, and this isn't a party political point, but actually you need to organize the bodies of government, the institutions of government around delivery. That I think is it. You need every single department to understand its role. Our sector, wind, touches on the MOD, it touches on DEFRA, it touches on Treasury, obviously on the Energy Department, on the Education Department. The cross-cutting nature of the challenge is, really needs to be galvanized in the way you deliver policy and the way you deliver programs of government.
Thanks, Dan. Well, thanks everyone for coming along to this launch event. Please do use this moment, 5 years to the day from net zero being signed into law, to really socialize the report. Please do share it on your social media channels, and hopefully 5 years on, you'll look back at this moment and remember where you were when hopefully we would have achieved a net zero grid by 2030. I personally just wanted to also add my thanks to Grace Girling, who's done so much to put this report together, to convene the Power Generation Network. So have a separate round of applause for Grace, actually sat here quietly. We have the room, as I said, till 11 o'clock. So are there questions that you wanted to ask? Didn't get the chance to ask them. Please do circulate and ask the panel if they're still around. And also enjoy the rest of London Climate Week.